Once again, we welcome you to Moving Forward with Young Voices. I'm happy to welcome Kat Dwyer back to the show. Kat, it is great to catch up with you once again, and let's tell people just a little bit, in addition to being a Young Voices contributor, tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Well, hi, Brian. Thank you for having me. In addition to being a Young Voices contributor, I work for a conservation research institute in Bozeman, Montana, called the Property and Environment Research Center. And we're the home of free market environmentalism. So we look for sort of private cooperative solutions to environmental challenges.
And I have to confess this. You have done a lot to get me to broaden my perspective on environmental concerns. I've been kind of closed-minded in the past simply because I've had the perception that, some environmentalists are very hardcore, dare I say almost Marxist in their approach. But I really like the way that you approach things. And we're going to talk about an article that you've written this is for InsideSources.com. It's time to increase domestic energy production. So I'm guessing you're probably feeling the pain at the pump as well as other people.
Oh, yeah, I absolutely am. We're over $4 a gallon here in Montana, and in my home state of California, they're over $6. So in some places. So, yeah, we're all feeling the pain at the pump, and inflation, of course, is driving a big part of that. So I think it's really making us have to get sort of real and serious about our energy policies and our climate policies here in the U.S. Despite President Biden's contention that green energy is the solution to higher gas prices, we know by now that renewables alone are not a viable alternative to fossil fuels. And that's because of their intermittent power generation and our current lack of battery storage capacity. So they're not a serious alternative to fossil fuels. So it's now widely acknowledged that any sort of green energy transition requires partnering renewables like solar and wind with a reliable baseload energy source. And that baseload energy can be either fossil fuels like natural gas, or it can be nuclear. And in my opinion, I'm a big fan of nuclear. I've written about that a lot in the past. But until that option is more scalable, we really have no choice but to turn to fossil fuels. So I like to say nuclear should be our future, but fossil fuels must be our present.
Can we go down a little sidetrack here for a moment to talk just for a moment? Why isn't nuclear energy more scalable at this point?
It's complicated, but I think the short answer is basically because of regulation. There was for several decades now, and we're kind of maybe starting to emerge from it, but in some ways still in it, a really concerted campaign to sort of discredit nuclear based on fears of, Fukushima-like meltdowns, right? And so it's been the regulations placed on it, and getting a new facility online are so onerous that it makes it incredibly expensive and time consuming. So, and then of course it's competing with other alternatives like solar and wind that are heavily subsidized, right? So it's kind of been placed at a disadvantage because of government regulation.
Okay, I appreciate that explanation. Now, back to energy, increasing domestic energy production. I noticed one of the very first things that President Biden did when he took office was shut down the Keystone XL pipeline. So right off the bat, I have this perception that perhaps he was a little bit hostile to the fossil fuel sector. How is that affecting us in terms of not just our well-being here at home, our pocketbooks when we go to gas up and the cost of everything arriving in the stores? How does that tie into our national security?
Oh, for sure. It definitely ties into our national security. And I guess I'll first start off by just saying that, the fossil fuel industry, just like any other industry, is going to respond to Biden's climate messaging. And to kind of illustrate that point, there was a recent survey by the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas. And that survey found that 59% of oil and gas executives said pressure from investors is the primary reason that major companies are restraining production growth. So they, like anyone else, have to sort of invest capital, right, in producing, in increasing and scaling their production capacity. And that capital investment requires risk, and it requires some level of confidence that policymakers aren't going to throw sand in the gears of your operation. So when the president's talking about phasing out fossil fuels, of course, companies are going to be reluctant to invest in its future. And you're right. Biden did block the Keystone XL pipeline, and then he also paused federal oil and gas leasing. And I think both of those things, along with sort of anti-fossil fuel appointment nominees and that sort of thing, kind of sent flashing red signals to the industry that the tide was turning. And I'll note that the leasing pause has since been blocked in court, but the administration is appealing that decision. And technically, this is something that Democrats like to point to, but it kind of lacks the full context. Technically, the administration has approved permits to drill new oil wells, but it hasn't actually conducted any onshore auctions for new leases. So effectively, the ban is preventing any new actual sales of leases to drill on federal lands. So all of that, of course, is going to kind of stymie the growth of our domestic production. And then in terms of national security, well, the Biden administration right now, finally was pressured by Congress to stop importing Russian oil. And that was a small share of our overall, consumption, but still we were importing from Russia. So he finally was pressured to stop that. However, now he's trying to maybe cut a deal with the Iranians or the Venezuelans to potentially lift sanctions so we can start importing oil from them, which to me is just, it's totally reckless. Those are arguably maybe even more dangerous regimes, right? And then the irony of all ironies is that the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov is actually mediating the negotiations with Iran over lifting sanctions to start importing oil. So at the same time that we're punishing Russia, we're letting them negotiate our deal with the leading state sponsor of terror. So none of it really makes sense. And obviously, the better solution would be to get out of the way of the fossil fuel industry domestically and increase our production here at home.
Talk to us about the Jones Act and how that affects the ability to produce and to ship, energy here locally.
Yeah. So the Jones Act is kind of it's sort of a favorite of libertarians to point to as like an obvious thing that should be reformed. So it's a World War I era regulation that essentially makes it really costly and cumbersome to ship American crude from the Gulf of Mexico to our coastal ports. So because there are no pipelines connecting our coast to American crude in the Permian Basin, which is our largest oil field, we have to import from overseas. So sort of the lack of pipelines and the Jones Act are pretty much the driving factors for why we're even importing Russian oil to begin with. So eliminating this kind of arcane regulation really should be a no-brainer. And then the other thing that's kind of a reality that the left isn't pleased with, but it's becoming increasingly obvious to me, is that we really just need to be building more pipelines. Because we have, we've got a lot in the Permian Basin, but we just can't distribute it across the country effectively. So pipeline construction and doing away with cumbersome regulation would be a good first step.
Is it likely that any kind of shift is going to take place politically that would allow that mindset, or is the Biden administration dug in pretty deep on this issue?
Unfortunately, right now, it seems like they're dug in, and the Democrats realize that they have to do something. And unfortunately, they're kind of going back to their standard playbook of fingering, big oil as the boogeyman that's the problem, right? And so, like Bernie Sanders, for example, has introduced or he's proposed the Ending Corporate Greed Act, which would slap a 95% tax on excess profits of corporations worth more than $500 million in yearly revenue. And he made a point that if this had been in place last year, Chevron would have paid an additional $12.9 billion in taxes. And then the idea basically is tax the oil companies, and then whatever revenues you get from that, we can write checks and send those to the American people, which is just, it's so economically illiterate because one, increasing the cost of production is going to be that, that cost will be passed on to consumers in the form of higher prices. Yep. And then subsidizing supply with more, free money from the government is only going to drive inflation higher and drive prices higher. So both are really bad decisions, but it seems like they're dug in with their sort of standard position.
All right. Again, we are talking with Kat Dwyer. She is a Young Voices associate contributor. She also works with the Property and Environment Research Center, and you are the host of the Whiskey Bench podcast. Where can people? Oh, go ahead.
Oh, yeah. Thank you for mentioning that. Yeah, the Whiskey Bench podcast is a weekly show with my buddy. We have cocktails and we kind of talk shop about politics and economics. And we're on any streaming platform. So Spotify, iTunes, you name it, we're there.
Okay. It's a great show, by the way, and I'm so glad that you are putting your voice out there and calling for this increase in domestic energy production. I just hope that the right people will start listening so we can pay less for gas.
Me too.
Thanks so much for being on the show.
Thank you, Brian.
And we are back. This is Moving Forward with Young Voices. Happy to welcome Mark Bewley to the program. Mark, this is our first time visiting. So if you would, introduce yourself and tell us just a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Yeah, thank you, Brian. I really appreciate you having me on. So my name is Mark Bewley. I am currently an MA fellow at George Mason University, the Mercatus Center there. I have a focus and a specialty in healthcare policy. I've been working with a team there, analyzing a variety of things, getting into Medicare, Medicaid, different ideas for how we can improve our system here in the U.S. So,
well, and Medicare and Medicaid are very sacred topics, at least for politicians. I mean, nobody wants to be the politician who's going to either reduce or cut back, or even eliminate those programs. You mentioned in this article that I'm looking at from freethepeople.org that, politicians seem to love this, but they would be wise to remember Australian healthcare during COVID, which can actually help us learn a thing or two about the problems with Medicare for all. Set the stage for us. What can we learn from the way Australia handled COVID that would also translate well to our own situation with Medicare for all?
Yeah. So an interesting thing happened back in December of last year. We had a threat come out of the government of Australia, specifically the government of New South Wales. And they were sort of batting around a proposal that would essentially remove unvaccinated citizens from the list of people who could receive the quote unquote universal health care that is provided to Australians. So basically, it's a system where the universal health care is not so universal. And I think that shows us something about the way that when we decide to give the power of an industry, the healthcare industry, over to government bureaucrats, what we find is that they may not really have our best interests in mind.
Boy, to put it mildly. I mean, look, I followed very closely the coverage of Australia's response to COVID, and New South Wales. I mean, Australia generally took a pretty hard line approach, but New South Wales was especially strict. So that's a very chilling idea that, if you're not vaccinated, if you don't meet this qualification, well, maybe you should be denied health care. Seems like competition is a good thing after all.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and that's a big reason that healthcare sort of stuck out to me as a place to really dig into the policy, because I'm a master's student. I worked for a few years in the private sector. I had my own private health insurance, and then I became a master's student. I went off my employer-based insurance. And I found it extremely difficult to find a plan that worked well for me. I'm a young, healthy 26-year-old man. And the way that our system works, even though we aren't fully to the Medicare for all system, which would be an even smaller set of choices for us. We have one health insurance provider that we can receive coverage from. Even now with our semi-private system, I still found it hard to find a good health insurance plan for me. And so I think when people consider these things like Medicare for all, what they're really not understanding is how much their choice for health insurance will be limited. And New South Wales is a perfect example of how that can be really catastrophic. You know, a decision that was once thought of to be a private decision, what you do with your own vaccinations, it's private, it's a personal choice. And yet, you know, New South Wales shows us that once we give that power over to the government, what was once private becomes a matter of public debate, where my healthcare is being decided by a bureaucrat.
As you point out in your article, this looks like, such proposals of Medicare for all would also be another giant step toward that full-fledged universal single-payer system, which I'm only looking back a few years, but during the Obama administration, that was definitely a goal on the part of some within the federal government, and I don't think that goal has ever entirely gone away, has it? Yeah,
that's one of the most scary things. Even if we look back at the last Democratic primary election for the president, you see, I mean, even our current vice president, Kamala Harris, had a proposal that was a sort of a overtime piecemeal moving step by step toward a single payer system was sort of Kamala Harris's plan. And we saw that also with like Bernie Sanders's plan, Elizabeth Warren. And it's an interesting point you bring up, because I think with Australia specifically, they still have options for private health insurance. Now many people aren't expecting to have to go to private health insurance or pay those premiums, but they at least have the option. The plans that have been laid out by Kamala Harris, by Elizabeth Warren, by Bernie Sanders, those plans all completely eliminate the possibility of having a private insurance plan. And that means that if you're sort of comparing the situation, an unvaccinated person in America could be threatened with literally no other alternative. You know, there's no way that they could pay for healthcare at all unless they decide to get vaccinated. And I just think that's a travesty. It would be just one of the worst things we could see happen to our country.
Let's underline that last point too. Tell us about Jason Wilson and his story.
Yeah. So Jason Wilson, it's kind of a crazy example. Jason Wilson had a kidney disease and was on a transplant list. I think he was on the transplant list for over a decade waiting. And, thankfully he had survived that long. And now with all of the COVID world changing around him, he was removed from the transplant list at his local hospital just because he decided not to get vaccinated. And so what we're seeing here, fortunately for Jason, he has the freedom in America to go find a different hospital that will allow him to be on a transplant list. I mean, obviously, it's still a huge upending of his plans, but he still has the freedom to do that. If Medicare for all were to pass, he would have none of those options. He would be stuck in a situation where he would either have to decide, do I want a chance to survive another couple of decades, or am I going to, take this shot that I don't think is right for me?
Yeah, it seems like a really difficult dilemma. And in fact, it's like being on the horns of a dilemma. Look, either you allow government to do this, to make sure that everybody has access, and government, of course, will do its very best to try to, apply things as universally as possible, like taxes, But the downside is it can also be politicized, which means it can be turned around and weaponized against people who are, shall we say, not on board with whomever happens to be in power at the moment.
Exactly. And that's something I think we've seen time again, whether it's, the on and off rumblings of Dr. Fauci or other different political actors, is that this is a pandemic that's, supposed to be about people's health. And time again, we've seen the public health establishment really seeking its own interests and not the interests of the public health. And so I think it's just a stark example of why those freedoms that we have are something that we should be looking to build upon and not to give up. And I think that Medicare for all is just something that we're going to see ourselves giving up a freedom that we're going to have a hard time taking back.
Yeah, it sounds like we face the prospect of if you give up, some of that security of having government to make it for everybody, you're going to have a measure of freedom that will nonetheless be more useful in the long run. I hope that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
Tell people where they can find you online, either on social media or find your writings.
So I'm a contributor at Young Voices. That's mostly where I do my work. I might have a couple of pieces coming through at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University, so you can look for the website there.
Welcome back to Moving Forward with Young Voices. We are pleased to welcome Tex Fischer to the show. Tex, this is your first time on. In addition to being a Young Voices contributor, tell us about who you are and what makes you tick.
Sure. Thanks for having me, Brian. So I'm a Republican political strategist based in Northeast Ohio. I work primarily in digital media, and my firm works all across the country, but Ohio is where I call home and the area that I care about the most. So that's really what makes me tick.
All right, I'm looking for an article. I'm looking at an article that you wrote for Cincinnati.com, The Inquirer, and you point out it's redistricting season in America. And my first thought is, that always seems to be a topic that's a bit contentious. Why is redistricting so much a political tug of war?
Sure. So redistricting, it's definitely not a new thing, but I think the last couple of cycles have definitely taken on a new level of intensity. I think social media has a lot to do with that. I think the vast network of national special interest groups on both the left and the right have definitely contributed towards it being a little bit of a higher stakes process than it might have been in decades prior. But I think the biggest driver of that is social media.
Okay. And of course, it seems like I'm not trying to just pin this on one side or the other, but it seems like anytime someone is redrawing political districts, there's always an eye towards how can we work this to our advantage. Talk to me about what you see in your home state of Ohio and how is it exposing hypocrisy? Absolutely.
So, part of the whole crux of the article that I wrote was that redistricting is an inherently political exercise. I think people, when they try and make it about fairness and these very aspirational, lofty, words that we typically hear from folks on the left side of the aisle, I think it's fundamentally dishonest. I don't think there's ever been an example anywhere in the country in the last couple of cycles where there hasn't been a pretty strong political angle towards redistricting, even in the states where they have the so-called independent redistricting commissions. You still end up with pretty partisan outcomes. A great example of that would be California, where they drew 40 plus out of their states, I believe 53 congressional seats to be safe Democrat. Obviously, California is a very blue state, but I don't think it's quite that blue. So even when you have the politicians totally removed from the process with good faith intentions, the result still ends up being kind of partisan. So I really don't think there's any way around that. Where I take issue is when Democrats in particularly in my state of Ohio, shroud their own political self-interest in this language of fairness and decency. And it's just very dishonest because they're really not looking for fairness. They're looking for favorable outcomes for themselves, which is totally fine. I don't take issue with a political party pursuing their own self-interest. I think that's kind of the nature of politics, but I take issue with the dishonest language, and I think they're lying to voters.
Now, does this boil down to simply, an expression of the rural versus urban divide, or is it a little more nuanced than that?
So I think it's a little more nuanced than that. In Ohio, we're dealing with some pretty significant shifts in our voter base. So the part of Ohio where I'm from, which is the Mahoning Valley in Northeast Ohio, is one of the biggest swings from left to right over the past decade. So I think that also plays plays a major role into how these maps are drawn, particularly at the state legislative level. We're dealing with 99 House districts and 33 Senate districts. A lot more, a lot more wiggle room than the 15 congressional districts that we're dealing with. And the state legislative maps are the ones that are currently held up in the Supreme Court. So we're facing most likely a split primary where we're going to have pretty much everybody except for state House and state Senate races on the ballot on May 3rd. But because of the ongoing litigation, the state House and state Senate races are likely not going to be decided until a special election in August.
Now, as you point out in your article, this isn't just a matter of polite disagreement of, well, I think that could be done better. I mean, there are phrases being thrown about like an assault on democracy or shameful abuse of power. Are those words rooted in reality, or is this just political rhetoric turned up to 11?
Oh, absolutely not. There's no basis in reality for this. I point out in the article that there was, in the initial redistricting period back last fall, Democrats' last best offer, so they branded it, it was actually more favorable to Republicans in the last two sets of maps that were passed by the Redistricting Commission after being rejected by the Supreme Court, as far as like raw top line numbers go. So I think it's fundamentally dishonest. I don't think there's any basis in reality for that type of language. I think it is a very, very dishonest group of people driven by national influences, Eric Holder, Mark Elias, all sorts of national Democratic figures whose objective is basically just to clog up the redistricting process in Ohio courts for as long as humanly possible, which they've done a great job of doing. Since we're not going to have this decided on May 3rd, we're going to have most of this decided in August. So props to them for being successful in managing to drag out what should have been a process that wrapped up in September, October of last year, now running into April of the following year. So I don't think there's any basis in reality there. I think it is just hyperbolic nonsense being pushed by Democrats and their allies.
I'm certainly not trying to excuse, the politicking that goes on with this kind of redistricting. It's very clear. It's a power struggle. They want power. They're not eager to give up what power they have. Are there any states or any other places you can look to as examples of how to do this efficiently, equitably, to where it doesn't become such a politicized melodrama?
No, I really don't think there's a way to take politics out of redistricting. Like I mentioned earlier, even the states with the independent commission still end up having a partisan bent because you're not going to be able to find enough people with, I guess, enough of an interest or an expertise in political map making that aren't going to have their own agendas. So I think it's just an inherently political process. And there are a lot of guardrails that some states have put in place, including Ohio, which I thought were well-intentioned, things that I voted for. Minimizing county splits for the congressional map. I think that's a common sense thing. You want to keep communities together. Those are objectives that I think people on both sides of the aisle agree with in theory. Where it becomes difficult in practice is with a state like Ohio, you have Democratic voters concentrated in basically three areas and very minimally dispersed outside of those three areas. So outside of the three Cs, Cleveland, Columbus, and Cincinnati, there are not really critical masses of Democratic voters to really draw enough competitive or blue-leaning congressional districts to match the objectives of, top line fairness or a top line breakdown that matches your typical statewide election results, which is one of the criteria in the constitutional amendments passed over the last few years in Ohio, which have kind of led to this process, was in addition to the county splits and not splitting municipalities, which were common sense, they also included language saying that the breakdowns of these maps have to closely align with the partisan preferences of voters over the previous decade. So there's a lot of discussion about what that means. Republicans contend that number is higher than Democrats do, obviously, but that has been the major sticking point, was proportionality. But it's tough. A state like Wisconsin is dealing with a similar issue. They're a much more competitive state at the federal level. The last two presidential elections, they're within 1 or 2 points, whereas Ohio has been a 8+ percentage point win for Republicans, both of the last two presidential elections. So it's a little bit different. But Wisconsin, they kind of gave up on their objectives of trying to get of getting an even map as far as the breakdown goes for the congressional side. Whereas Ohio, that it's a lot harder to get there. You have to think a lot more outside the box, so to speak. And to do that, you end up having to split municipalities and break up communities of interest, all for the sake of pursuing that top line number that's more favorable to Democrats.
Tex, is this something that matters to the voters, or is this something that just kind of plays in the background and the voters don't really sit up and pay attention until actual election times come around? So
I don't think this is as big of an issue on the mind of voters as some people think. right now, if you talk to the average person in this area, they have no idea who they're voting for. They probably just figured out who their representative was over the past couple of years, because we've had a couple of election swings in the left to right shift that my area has seen in particular. So I don't think voters are spending a whole lot of time thinking about how redistricting affects them. I think they just want to understand who their options are and start to educate themselves. And I think particularly Democrats make this into a much bigger issue than it is. And honestly, Democrats have been running on gerrymandering for the past 10 years, and they've won 2 statewide elections in that time frame. And both of those were Senator Sherrod Brown. They haven't won governor's race, haven't won any other statewide offices with partisan labels on them outside of the Supreme Court, pretty much in the last decade. So if they want to continue to run on this, more power to them. I don't think it's really an argument that resonates with the voters, especially when we're seeing gas prices over $4, or Ohio is, we're well known for our corruption. Unfortunately, we had a pretty explosive bribery scandal over the past couple of years. So I don't think voters are sitting around at night thinking about redistricting, but that's just my take on it.
For those voters, or at least for the person who wants to get their mind around the importance of redistricting, are there any good resources to turn to outside of the political parties themselves? It sounds like Republicans have gerrymandered too, so it's not like they can necessarily claim the moral high ground, but it seems like there has to be some place people could become better informed and better engaged to make this less of an issue.
Sure. As far as resources and organizations to point you to, I probably couldn't point you to a truly objective, an objective or fair analysis of that. Or all the organizations that work on redistricting have their own agendas. A great example of that is also here in Ohio, where the League of Women Voters is very much walking in lockstep with the Democrats in this state, really along every step of the way. They basically promised to sue and challenge the maps before they were even unveiled back during the initial redistricting period. So there really are no good nonprofit organizations that I'm aware of for how to get good information on this. I would suggest people spend a little bit of time researching things themselves, not just reading talking points from Republicans or Democrats on Twitter. Is do a little bit of a deep dive, look at the maps. You can look at election results. 538 has a lot of great resources that are data-based, and obviously they have their own editorialization in some areas, but they're a great source for getting fairly decent data. And, I found that actually a lot of folks on Twitter are really good at this.
We're talking with Tex Fischer from Young Voices. Welcome back to Moving Forward with Young Voices. This is our final segment today, and we are happy to welcome Leslie Corbly. She is a Young Voices contributor as well as a policy analyst for Libertas Institute. And Leslie, tell us anything else about yourself that you would want our audience to know.
Hi, thanks for having me on. I really appreciate the opportunity. My name, as you know, all is Leslie Corbly, and I really focus my area of work on privacy and individual rights, sort of that intersection of why a fundamental sense of privacy is very important for individual rights and for human flourishing in general, and for the advancement of free societies. So that's what I do.
Okay, I'm looking at an op-ed that you wrote for the Ogden Standard Examiner. Latest CIA revelations show clear need for privacy protections. And people can't see it, but I'm nodding my head enthusiastically. Talk to me about these latest CIA revelations and what we can learn from them.
Sure. So what these latest revelations show is that federal norms involving bulk data collection is what specifically highlights that need for states to push back against invasive policing practices. So these revelations show that in relation to how information is collected, retained, and stored is not really done in a private manner. Shocker. I know most of our listeners probably are not surprised to hear that the Central Intelligence Agency collects bulk data. But as it turns out, Senators Wyden of Oregon and Heinrich, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, of New Mexico, wrote a letter in April of last year. And that letter led to information coming out that shows that there's even more of a greater need for transparency than previously known. And again, that relates to the collection, retention, and use of data that the CIA collects. So again, this is not a new problem. It's actually quite an old one, which is that the federal norms surrounding the use of data are kind of inverted from what you would want. Those norms are to extend virtually no privacy protections to individuals. So that's a big problem. States can and should push back against this, understanding the problem for what it is and recognizing that privacy is fundamental to human freedom.
Okay, now I'm going to push back a little bit and play devil's advocate just a little bit, Leslie. But we live in such a dangerous world, some will say. Why? How could we possibly allow there to be privacy when somebody could be up to no good? Your answer?
Sure. We've always lived in a dangerous world. There's never been a time in human history, where there has not been danger, and even significant danger. Indeed, we live in a much safer time now than in other eras. So I would argue that. And then as well, that when you erode the rule of law, there are severe consequences for that. So some of these executive orders and issues that have brought up privacy concerns date back to even the 1980s. And this one in particular relates back to Executive Order 12333, labeled Central Intelligence Agency Deep Dive 2. So these are old problems. And it's not new to hear that think there's danger, there's national security concerns, so on and so forth. And that being said, as someone who cares about privacy, I do also care about national security. And I don't think that there needs to be that same dichotomy that a lot of people see with that issue. We can protect our national security interests without abandoning the right to privacy. And indeed, I would argue that we go down a very troubling road when we walk away from privacy and are willing to allow federal agencies to operate outside the scope of law, because that's very dangerous for citizens. What's most dangerous, I would argue, for citizens is not actually what's out there in foreign lands, but if your government inverts on you and turns on you and begins to see private citizens as not citizens, really, as if they can act outside the law, I think you're in a lot more danger than you otherwise would be.
That is a magnificent answer. You answered that extremely well. Now, if I'm not mistaken, you work in Lehi, Utah? Or at least
yes, that is where I work.
And I used to live in Lehi, Utah, and just out there across from the point of the mountain was the great big NSA Data Collection Center, which was celebrated when it came to the state of Utah as, but look at all the jobs this is going to create. And it seems like very few people, from the politicians on down, stop to consider what that really represents as a giant vacuum that's sucking up every bit of information about all of us, just in case someday it needs to make a case against us. I wonder why so few people were able to see the potential shortfalls of something like that, or pitfalls of that.
I think it's an easy problem to ignore unless you're actively involved in an investigation that's gone sideways, or if there's something that's really impacting your day-to-day life. I think a lot of people sort of have that latent understanding of it in the back of their head that, there's no privacy, but that's just the way the world is going right now, which is true to a degree. I mean, we are trending that direction, I would argue, for the worse, which is why there's hope that we can right the ship. And that states could be on the forefront of that, as they have been in other administrative contexts. So again, one of the central issues being that this involves agencies stepping outside the boundaries of their constitutional obligations, duties, abilities, so on and so forth, and sort of amassing more power than they should have. So to the extent that that's the problem, there has been state pushback wanting to bring agency power back within the purview of the constitutional boundary, which would be that they'd not step beyond the separation of powers. So I think that that's a really great trend that we're seeing at the state level. And Utah has been involved in that, which is fantastic to see.
Talk to me about what Utah has done. I know they've been one of the states that it's actually led out in terms of privacy. What have they done?
So Utah has really emerged as a leader nationally in privacy. On the Supreme Court side, so on the judicial side, Utah Supreme Court has rejected what's called the doctrine of deference. That's a federal Supreme Court doctrine related to how judges should view lower court rulings as it relates to administrative procedures. So not to get too in the weeds with that, but essentially the Chevron doctrine stated that judges should have a deferential stance towards administrative agency action. And the pushback against that is really rejecting that and saying, no, there's separation of powers, and recognizing the agencies sort of are engaging in both judicial, legislative, and executive functions, and therefore that's amassing power they should not have. So they rejected that deference, which is fantastic. In 2019, Utah passed the Electronic Information or Data Privacy Act, and that ensures that your electronic information is free from warrantless searches, which is obviously fantastic on that end. And that really undercuts sort of that third-party doctrine at the Supreme Court level, which, holds that when you put your information out to a third party, that's almost all electronic information flows through a third party, you have a reduced expectation of privacy. So that starts to rein that in and ensure that citizens in Utah can feel secure in their person's papers and effects, whether that's physical or digital. And we also created, through legislation, a position for state privacy officer and commission. And these are designed to ensure state agencies are upholding individual privacy rights. So ensuring that whatever practices they put in place for the implementation of administrative action. So as we know, agencies implement all kinds of things, from, welfare benefits to dealing with roads and bridges, all kinds of local things, wanting to make sure that that's done with privacy in mind, and how you're collecting, storing, and using data is clear and respects privacy interests. And then we also had a legislative win this past session, which is fantastic. As it turns out, the Department of Health, unfortunately, was requiring new mothers, once they had their children, to fill out a very invasive 100-question survey in order to access their children's birth certificate. So they could not either leave the hospital or file an application for a birth certificate without filling out the survey. That survey was being used for research purposes. It asked very invasive questions, everything from neonatal care, your use of vitamins, your use of contraceptives, whether you were using a surrogate, on and on and on. So this was all for research. Academics could then pay to access this information and clearly under the individual privacy rights of citizens and also their informed consent. They've just gone through labor. This is not great. So Utah passed a law that addressed that and scaled that back and made sure that new mothers knew the information that was required for the birth certificate was clearly delineated from that information that was purely voluntary. So it does not stop people from gathering research information if they're interested in providing that, but making it clear what's required by law versus what is completely up to the consent of the individual.
All right, Leslie, we're down to about 1 minute. I understand there are other states that are also starting to take some pretty serious steps towards privacy. Can you mention any of them?
Yes, you have Michigan, Maryland, and Montana that have also worked on these issues, and also New York, surprisingly, I believe, introduced, I don't remember the bill number, but introduced a bill recently that would also ban warrantless searches of digital information. So it's fantastic to see other states jump on board, even ones like New York, where you may not kind of expect to have a lot of overlap in agreement with them.
Well, I appreciate your efforts. I appreciate what you're doing, not only as a Young Voices contributor, but also as a policy analyst for Libertas Institute. Connor and the team there have done a lot to move the needle in the right direction toward freedom. So please give my regards to your team.
Thank you so much. It's my pleasure to be on, and I really appreciate you giving this opportunity and allowing me to talk to your listeners.
Okay, thanks again for being our guest. By the way, is there a place people can follow you on social media?
Yes, I'm on social media at Leslie Corbly, primarily on Twitter. That's almost pretty much my main platform right now. And all my articles flow through there. Everything I do, all these updates you'll see on my Twitter feed.